Hello, and welcome to the 2022 Virtual Spring Lecture Series, hosted by Grey Roots Museum and Archives. I'm your host, Karen Noble. We acknowledge with respect the history, spirituality, and culture of the Anishinaabe, Six Nations of the Grand River, Haudenosaunee, and Wyandot peoples, on whose traditional territories we gather, and whose ancestors signed treaties with our ancestors. We recognize also the Métis and Inuit whose ancestors shared this land and these waters. May we all, as treaty people, live with respect on this land and live in peace and friendship with all its diverse peoples. Today is the second talk of the Spring 2022 series. Next week, on Tuesday, April 19th at 1 p.m., Richard Thomas returns for Owen Sound, Becoming a City, 1920 through the Great Depression, a sequel to last week's talk. On Tuesday, April 26th at 1 p.m., join Peter Whitehead for Walt Disney's Ontario Connection. This final talk of the series is a live-only event taking place on Zoom. Email media@greyroots.com to register. Before we begin, there will be a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. You're welcome to submit a question in the YouTube comments. Please note, you must be logged into a YouTube account to do so. If you're watching on greyroots.com, access the YouTube page by clicking Watch on YouTube.com in the bottom right of the video player. You can also submit a question to Grey Roots through Facebook Messenger or over email to media@greyroots.com. Thank you to Zach Erb, Media and Communications Coordinator at Grey Roots, for providing technical support for the series. And now for the presentation of the day, Breaking the Silence, Canada's British Home Children. This talk will remain posted to view, so if you lose your connection, have to stop watching, want to watch any part again, or tell a friend, you can still do so. Link available from greyroots.com or visit the Grey Roots Museum and Archives YouTube channel. Today's presenter, Lori Oschefski, is president of Home Children Canada, now a registered charity, which he founded in 2012. Home Children Canada is now the leading organization in the world advocating for the lost voices of children brought to our shores. Home Children Canada provides families with a platform to tell their stories and find free help with their own family research. Lori's personal connection comes through her mother, who arrived in Canada in 1924 at the tender age of 2. Lori will share the history of home children along with tips for research. There were home children who were brought to Grey County, often to work on farms. In 2012, Oschefski founded the research group, British Home Children Advocacy and Research Association, which now boasts over 10,000 members. Through her work, she has assisted authors, students, filmmakers, museums, and university studies with their research and projects. She also served as historical consultant on the 2020 Canadian best-selling novel, The Forgotten Home Child. Lori is proud to be the driving force behind recognition of the wartime service of home children by Veterans Affairs Canada. In 2016, Lori attended a garden party at Buckingham Palace, one of 4 Canadians invited by Barnados to represent home children at their 150th anniversary celebrations. And now, welcome, Lori.
Thank you. Just gonna do my little screen sharing thing here to get started. I'm really pleased to be asked to come out and speak for Grey Roots today on the home children. We had very, very many home children that were sent up into that area. I did an initial search today on our registry files just to get some idea of how many were sent in that area. And just a very, very initial search brought up over 100 names. So it, we had quite a few home children that were sent up to your area. Now, I don't know how many have actually heard about the British Home Children. There was, beginning in 1869, there was a mass wave of structured immigration of children from the United Kingdom to Canada. And it started and it lasted for, over 70, 80 years. There was over 100,000 children that were brought to our shores under these programs. Many of these children, if not most of these children, were forever separated from their families, friends, culture, and were here to work as laborers and domestics. There seem to be some myths that kind of have gone on over the years, that they were saved and that they were brought here to, to give them, a better chance at life. There were no opportunities in the UK. And a lot of cases that is certainly true, particularly when you're speaking about the beginning, which started in Victorian England. So it's indisputable that was the circumstance for a lot of children. But things changed around 1900 and it became a little bit different. So we're kind of here to discuss all this today. Collectively, the children are known as the British home children in Canada. Prior to 1997-ish, they were known just as home children, but the tag British was placed on the name to ensure that we knew, there was a difference between children that were in children's homes in Canada and the children that came from the UK. I have a personal connection to the home children, so I'm just going to briefly go over that today for you. My grandfather, William Cheeseman, was a Bernardo boy who was brought to Canada in 1894. He was taken out to Winnipeg, Manitoba, and out there he was trained in farming. And then he was sent out to some placements, but he eventually absconded and ran away. In 1912, he had made his way into Saskatchewan. He had a mail order bride by the name of Annie Prince that came from Lingden, Herefordshire into the area. They were married within hours of her stepping off the train. So it was some kind of an arrangement. I don't know what exactly the details are of that is. They had 5 children that were born in Rosetown, Saskatchewan. And then after an apparent fire in 1919, the family returned to England and returned to Lingden, Herefordshire. William Cheeseman stayed with that family initially to get them all settled in, but eventually he came back to Canada and eventually went back to the UK to pick up his family and to bring them back to Canada with him. Something happened on that second trip to the UK. Must have been a happy reunion because my mother was conceived, but the family broke up and William returned to Canada alone and leaving his family in the UK in dire straits. My grandmother didn't have any way to look after the children. So my mom, as a newborn child, was placed into the LinkedIn Union Workhouse over there. And they lived in abject poverty there for about 2 years before she was finally immigrated back to Canada at the age of 2. Now, as I kept digging in my family, I did find that we have a lot of home children in the family. And the picture that I have up on screen now is just some of the children, home children that are in my family tree. Now you can see this little picture up here. I don't know if you can see my cursor on screen or not, but the little picture up at the top here is my mother. And she was one of the lucky children in the fact that she received a good home and with parents that looked after her and welcomed her into the family as their own child. In fact, they did take the step further and they did legally adopt my mom, which is something a little bit different from what maybe the usual situation was with the home children. So she did get a good home. But these 2 little girls that are clasping their hands together, they came from very dire circumstances in England. They were actually dragged out from underneath the bed of a dying woman. They were saved when they were taken to Barkingside, and from Barkingside, they were then sent to Canada, again as home children. In Canada, the first little girl on the left, Mary Taylor, she was whipped, beaten, and she was moved over 20 times in 8 years. She gave birth to a stillborn baby at the age of 14. So definitely her treatment in Canada was not very good. It was horrendous and horrific, to say the least. But, eventually she married and she ended up having a very good life. But, somehow that just doesn't seem to make up for what happened to her in her childhood. Those things should have never happened. As I said, we have a lot of home children that were placed in Grey County, and a lot of them lived out their lives there. And, they contributed greatly to the community. And I just pulled up some of the names from our burial index. So you can see these are home children that are actually buried up in Grey County. There was over different sending organizations sending children to Canada. The best known was the Dr. Bernardo Homes, but other organizations also included Warriors, Fagans, Church of England, Waifs and Strays, Annie Mcpherson's, Maria Rye. There was a whole assortment of sending organizations. Unfortunately, the one that we know the most about is the Bernardo Homes, and that's because he had put out a lot of information into the public forum for many, many years, and that information is just more readily available. And plus, he was the organization that sent the most children. So there was over 30,000 children that Dr. Bernardo sent to Canada. Children were mostly sent in parties, often hundreds at a time, particularly in the early to the mid years. In the later years, those parties got considerably smaller, but it wasn't unusual to find a shipping list that lists like 400 children on the list coming over. They were each provided with a trunk or a duffel bag to carry their clothing in. Most common was, of course, the trunks, and over the years, there were many varieties of home children trunks that they brought with them. The one that we show in the picture here is one of the most common Dr. Bernardo trunks that we do find. They're pretty easy to spot. I mean, they've got, and just identifying things, sometimes they have the children's name written across it. Most of these little trunks will have little wheels on the bottom too, and that enabled the children to pull the trunks a little bit better. As you can imagine, a child in the trunk, I mean, those trunks, even though they're kind of light, they still would have been quite heavy for a child. Most people get the home children confused with the guest children. With the outbreak of the Second World War, there was about 1,500 children that were sent to Canada to protect these children against the ravages of the war. And when we do talk about the home children, a lot of people do think that we're talking about the guest children, and we're not. I mean, I think the primary difference is that the guest children only came from June of 1940 to August of 1940. So there wasn't very long that they sent the children. The home children came in 1869, and they went on until 1939 when it officially ended. Fairbridge Farms did bring children up until about 1948, but that's another part of this segment that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. With the guest children, the intention was to send them home after the war ended. And the intention was also that they were never to be put to work on our farms. There's a whole lot of literature contained in our House of Commons files that pertain to, to the guest children and trying to protect them against the same stigmatization and the work that was inflicted upon the home children. With the home children, there was no intention to send them back home again. It did happen in some cases, but the vast majority of these children never made it back to the UK, or they never saw their families or friends ever again. And over 100,000 came. Like I said, there was about 1,500 guest children that came. And guest children were here to be part of the family, and they weren't here to be worked. Home children were here to work. Now, the guest children, that came to an end when one of the ships that they were using in August of 1940 was torpedoed, the city of Benares, and it sank, and it killed almost 90 children that was on board that ship. So then they considered the seas too dangerous for children to be brought across. Interestingly enough, with the home children, also during the war years of the First World War, they also didn't send children during those years for the same reasons, that the seas were too dangerous for the children. And also, interestingly enough, it wasn't the Canadian government that put a stop to that. They were borderline blackmailing the sending organizations to continue sending the children despite the dangers of the seas. And it was actually the sending organizations that spoke up themselves and put an end to it. But shortly after the war, I think in 1921, they started again. And as we said before, I mean, there's no doubt that this migration program started in Victorian England with the Industrial Revolution. There was a complete influx of families and children and stuff into the larger cities like London, England. And it just caused a serious overcrowding situation with very impoverished living conditions, and really something needed to be done to help these families and to help these children out. And that's, where you get the term that they were gutter children and all the rest of it. I mean, it was the sending organizations that labeled them, particularly Maria Rye, as gutter children, but the children were living in the streets, and there was a high death rate because of the unsanitary living conditions and the diseases and stuff. So certainly something needed to be done. However, Canada did not want the poor children. They were diseased and they carried genetic defects, and they were concerned that they were going to contaminate our good Canadian stock with their diseases and then their degeneracies. There were some pretty horrific things that were written about the home children. Again, I go back to the House of Commons. It's hard to find in Canada any kind things that were said about the home children in any of our literature, our newspapers. It's pretty a hard thing to take a look through all that and just to see exactly what was said about these children. But one of the most horrific things I think that I wrote was written by Frederick Nichols, who was a member of our House of Commons and also the head of the Canadian Manufacturers Association. And he wrote the magazine for the Canadian Manufacturers Association. And one of those magazines, in one of the articles he wrote, "These wastes and strays are tainted and corrupt with moral slime and filth inherited from parents and surroundings of the most foul and disgusting character, and all the washings and clean clothes that Dr. Bernardo may bestow cannot possibly fit them so that they will become desirable citizens of Canada. Cleanse the lepers," is what he said, which is, there's no words for that. And that kind of attitude that was put out by our medical community and by our House of Commons, and we can go back to Dr. C.K. Clark, who was the head of Canadian psychology, and he was the dean of psychology at the Queen's University in Kingston. And in one of his lectures, he said that in Canada we are deliberately adding to our population hundreds of kids bearing all the stigmata of physical and mental degeneracies. The next generation must be considered, but the harvest has already commenced. An insane person here, a criminal there. So when these children were brought into Canada, I mean, our citizens were taught and told that they were diseased, that they were going to infect us. I mean, syphilis was also something that Dr. Clark said that, they would pass that on to our good Canadians. These children were on a whole, really, were not treated very well on the farms when they got here to Canada. They were made to sleep in barns. They were made to sleep in unheated attics. They were kept distant from the family members, from the farmers' families and stuff like that. And, we had surviving home children that told us that, that they were told that they were nobody. That he said, whenever a family came over, I was told to get out. You're nobody. You're not wanted. In Grey County, we had the case of George Greene, and George Greene he came over in 1894, and by 1895 he was dead. He didn't spend all that long in Canada before the authorities found his body laying on a bed of straw in the most disgusting and foul circumstances that you could possibly ever imagine. He was starved, he was beaten, and there was just a hole cut out in the straw, and that's what he used as his toilet. Now, the woman that murdered him, Helen Finley, she was an educated and wealthy lady. She had her brother was living with her on this farm, and he had been kicked by a horse and killed. So she needed farm help. So I think she had one or two boys on the farm, but one of them that was unfortunately sent up there was George Greene. And there is a myth that kind of goes on that, with all the literature and stuff that's available on this case, that Helen Finley, she was arrested and charged with the murder of George Greene. And, that she was acquitted of all charges and was set free. But we did a fair bit of digging a number of years ago to find out exactly what happened there. And we did discover that that she did actually serve time at the Andrew Mercer Ontario Reformatory for females. And she served 1 year. And, in today's age, you'd probably never see the light of day again. So, we'd have to really take a look back to see exactly what sentences and stuff are being handed out during those years to murderers and that kind of stuff in order to make a fair comparison of how much time that she had to serve for the murder of George and how much that we would think would be reasonable. Doesn't sound like a lot for us in today's age, but sometimes we have to be careful that that we're not applying today's standards on what happened yesterday. But she did serve, and following her sentence, when she was released, she did marry and she moved into the United States, and that's where she lived out her life. In about 2013, we did put up a stone for George, and which was really neat. We did a lot of researching to find out exactly where he was buried. He's actually buried in the Finley family plot, but for reasons we were not able to put his gravestone on the plot exactly. So he's when you head into the cemetery up there, if you stand by the gate and you see George Greene's stone, if you look directly in front of the stone, the first monument that you see is the Finley Monument, and that is where he's buried. There were tens of thousands of children that were brought to Canada who were all put at great risk. There were no safeguards in place to ensure whether these children received a good home or they didn't. And we look back at the case between my mother and my Aunt Mary. And of course, my mother, it was the foster family that had her, and it was a neighbor that had seen my mom, just going down for tea or whatever. And she knew that her sister was having a difficult time having a baby and that she wanted a child. So she wrote a letter to her sister and said, well, you should come down and see this little girl. She's beautiful. And my adoptive grandmother did. And she picked her up and took her home that night, like she was a pet puppy. There was nobody there to screen her or to ask her what she was actually doing with this child. She just picked her up and took her away. And she was very lucky to have received, a decent home and good parents. My Aunt Mary, not so lucky. I mean, she was assigned a placement through the Bernardos, and she was reassigned, like I said, 20 times in 8 years. And, you think with all the horrible treatment that child endured, that somebody along the way would have put an end to it. But they never did. Never ever. And yet the Bernardo offices were completely aware of this. I mean, that's where I get the information from, is from her Bernardo records. That's why I know she was placed so many times. But, at one point she was just left on the street and, just left on the street. It's just very fortunate that she was able to overcome the emotional damage that would have been caused by all this, and to go on and to create a good life for herself. And that she did. I mean, she married a Bernardo boy who actually swooped in and saved her. And they created a wonderful life and family. And her grandchildren have nothing but fond memories of my Aunt Mary. Dr. Bernardo himself even perpetrated the thought that they weren't here to, to be joined in families and become part of a loving family environment. And this was published in 1890. And he said, we are not so young and unsophisticated as to imagine that the farmers take our boys for love. The primary object of the farmers in taking a boy is that his services be useful to him. They were here to work. They were indentured servants, which meant that the vast majority of these children were contracted to work. And they had legally binding contracts. If the boy left the farm, they could get the authorities involved and have the child returned to the same placement. It didn't matter if there was abuse or whatever going on in most cases. In some cases, Dr. Bernardo's came in and saved them from the abuses that some of them were enduring. But this is an example of Cecil Bennett's contract, and he was indentured from September of 1907 to April of 1913 for $120 minus expenses. That's $120 for that whole entire term. And when we say minus expenses, if he had to have clothing, if he had to have haircuts, all that would have come out of his savings account. And each Bernardo boy, and I'm not sure about the girls, we need to still do more research on that, but each of the Bernardo boys was forced to give $1 donation a year back to Bernardo's. So that came off of that as well too. So you start whittling away at that. There's not a lot of money there. And then the boys' money was held in trust for them until they were 21. And then the money was released. By the time Cecil turned 21, he had enlisted in the First World War and he had died at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. So where did his money go? Following the George Greene case in 1897, he was killed in 1895. You would think that there would be laws placed in Canada to protect these children. And in fact, there were not. It was the 1897 an act to regulate the immigration into Ontario of certain classes of children. Canada was concerned that these children were, as they called them in their House of Commons, garbage. That was an actual term used. Bringing children into this country was like taking garbage and throwing it in your neighbor's yard and expecting it to stay there, was the quote. The act was put into place to protect us against the children who were intellectually or physically defective or who had been convicted of a crime. And a crime could be stealing food, it could be stealing a bit of money. I mean, home children, acted out in various different ways. And some did commit crimes. And, but Dr. Bernardo, he claimed he only sent the best children to Canada. William Poirier was so angry at this law that was put into place because he felt that he was already sending a good quality of child to Canada, that he actually stopped sending the children. And it wasn't until after his death in the early 1900s that his daughter continued sending children to Canada under his name. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting things when you go into the back and you're looking at the mandate of these laws and how these things were possible and what happened. But again, you would think after the horrible things that happened to George Greene, which was very, very well known in our papers, in our House of Commons, that we would put things into place to help these children. And that simply wasn't the case for a very, very long time. In fact, I don't think there was anything really done until about the 1920s. Because we put pressure on the sending organizations to not send us these defective children, there was certain things that were in place, like to bring the children into Canada, there was a bonus system that was placed. And that happened from the very early years. But what they did was if you sent, and it was $2 a head to bring, for each child brought into Canada, the sending organizations in the UK would match that, and they would also give $2 a head, I guess, in UK funds to the sending organizations. If the child came from a workhouse, then they did not qualify for a bonus because they were undesirable citizens of our, of our country. And just as a word, my mother was a workhouse child, so she wasn't even worth a $2 bonus that they paid to get her into Canada, which is really interesting. So it kind of flipped, in about the 1900s. And they started, again, looking for a more desirable class of child. So they started targeting more families that were in need, after, and like I said, in about the early 1900s. In today's society, I know particularly in Canada, we have things like social systems and welfares and, food banks and different things that are put into place to help families in need. But they didn't put those safeguards in place in the UK for a very, very long time. And so, of course, the institutions that they built encouraged you to drop off your child. And so anything that would have brought anything that would bring a person to the welfare office in Canada. So say a death of a parent or a breakup of a marriage, or, you know, maybe an illness or extreme poverty and that kind of stuff. I mean, your choices were either you put them into the bleak environment of the workhouse, or you relinquish them to one of the child care organizations, Quarriers, Fagans, Bernardo's, that kind of thing. But what they didn't tell you when you brought your child and relinquished them, that by doing that alone, you forfeited your parental rights. So therefore, you no longer got to choose what happened to your child. And many parents did that, thinking that they would have their children there until times got better, and then they could come back and retrieve their children, only to find out that they had been shipped out of the country and sent to one of the colonies. When I say that, it's also, yeah, we also have to note that they didn't just come to Canada. They went to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. You know, so it wasn't just Canada that they were sent children, but Canada had the most children of all that were sent to our shores. In the UK, Canada was marketed as a haven for children. Various things that they did is they sold promotional postcards, and there's all kinds of postcards that are available out there, and Home Children Canada does have a lot of them in our collections. But, you know, they give, I think, you know, a very wrong impression about what life is like, you know, what life is going to be like for the children, you know, by showing these mansions and big, you know, big buildings that they call, you know, are going to be their homes. And, you know, and they also sent a lot of, they also published a lot of magazines as well, too. I know that the Bernardos had published the ups and downs and the nights and days, and the Our Darlings. Fagans did the Red Lamp series, and Warriors did the Narrative of Facts. And in those books, you very seldom see anything about abuse or neglect or hard work or any of really the truth about what was going on with a lot of the children in Canada. You know, a lot of it was just embellished, wonderful stories. And, you know, and again, I gave the wrong illusion about what was happening here in Canada. The reality was that most of these children, instead of the big mansions that we're looking at, now mind you, some of the girls did get into those bigger homes as domestics, where they were put on farms. And I mean, these are lovely buildings. There's nothing wrong with them, but it's not a big mansion. And most of them were made to sleep in those barns, a lot of them. You know, George Greene was made to sleep with the pigs. You know, it was, like I said, there's not a lot of room, and the main part of the house would have been for the farming family and not the home child. So the home child would be in an attic or, you know, in a sunroom or something. And children were removed, as I said, from the UK without any further parental knowledge. I mean, this is an after sailing notice for Winifred Payne, and it was in 1905. And it just said that she had been deported to Canada sometime that month. What it doesn't say is that if you've changed your mind or times are better, you can come back and retrieve your child. It doesn't say if you want to say goodbye to your child, that you can come down to the docks and that you can say goodbye to them. It just simply says that she's left. And it doesn't tell you where she went or, you know, where she was going to be put out into place or anything like that. Just she left. And, you know, and then we get into a little bit of, you know, we already alluded to the bonus system that the organizations were paid for, you know, for each child coming into Canada. They were also paid for every application that was sent out for children. So for an example, you know, in 1909, there was 2,424 children immigrated. And out of that, there was 15,417 applications received and a $3 charge per application. And you can see here, there's the application form for one of the organizations. You can see a receipt from Dr. Bernardo's home, which Home Children Canada holds in our archives, for the $3 application fee. And then you can see the listing of how many children were immigrated and how many applications were received. So we know that that is a true number. And it was legal. I know, again, when I said that, when the children were placed into the custody of the Bernardo homes, or the children were relinquished, it was the Custody of Children's Act in 1891 that made that legal. It also made it legal for the organization to determine whether you were a fit or an unfit parent. So one of the representatives from Bernardo's could actually, or any of the organizations, could actually show up at your doorstep and demand that they release their children to you. And again, we take a look at the good and the bad. I mean, the estimates from David Lorente from the former Home Children Canada estimated that two-thirds of these children received terrible treatment, as then you see my Aunt Mary here. And then you see Cecil Bennett, the one that was indentured for only $120 for all his time served and died in the First World War. The family that took him in loved him, and they treated him just like a son. He had a fantastic placement with him. And we do have all of his artifacts, including his Good Conduct Medal. Now, each child that was able to stay in their placements for a set period of time did receive a Good Conduct Medal from, this is the one from Bernardo's. This is the silver medal that they did receive. And that would be their name engraved on the back. So we do have quite a few of these in our collections. And he did receive the Good Conduct Medal, and it was the farmers' descendants that kept all these things and kept them in good condition, and they've donated them to Home Children Canada. Now, most of his stuff is in our exhibit that we have at the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec. Deportation. If the children were in Canada here and they, caused any trouble, or had issues or anything like that, they could have been deported from our country. And some of the reasons why they would deport the children was insanity, becoming a public charge, vagrancy, arrested, various medical causes. One girl jumped out of the receiving home at the St. George's home in Ottawa, broke her spine, and she was deported back to the UK. And when you go through the newspaper archives and stuff like that, you find lots and lots and lots of articles and stuff like that about, about children that were labeled as home children or Bernardo children that caused problems in Canada, were robbing, or even, children that had murdered, and yet they were not home children. We've proven a lot of them to be untrue to be home children. And it just seemed that any child that had difficulties or had caused any problem or anything like that were simply labeled a home child or a Bernardo child. I mean, they just didn't take into any consideration that maybe they were Canadian-born children. And England did not stop the immigration of children until 1970. And we did talk about the immigration to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. They were still exporting children to the colonies until 1970. They just officially stopped here in Canada in 1938 because of the pushback that was starting in our country. We have over 4 million descendants in Canada, and yet the silence is resounding. And most of the home children didn't speak about their stories, and most of them couldn't. I mean, you have to think that we had over 100,000 children that came to Canada. So we had 100,000 children that suffered in their families already to begin with. I mean, there had to have been some suffering in their background in order to be brought into Bernardo's or relinquished or taken into care or whatever, So there was always emotional damage done to these children. And then you compound it by, first you put them into these organizations and you put them into an environment like Barkingside, where they were surrounded by hundreds of children like themselves, where they were clothed and they were fed. And, it may not have been ideal, but the point is when they went into these organizations, they were saved. They didn't need to send them to Canada to save them. They were saved. And then you remove them from that environment and you put them on a big boat, and they don't know really where they're going for or what they're doing, and You bring them into this country, and then you bring them into one of these big receiving homes, and then you take them out of that environment, and then you plunk them, on farms across Canada, isolated farms. Brothers and sisters were separated. Sometimes they did end up in positions where they were either placed close to each other or they were placed in the same home, but the vast majority of them were separated. And the only reason that they would stay in the same home together is if the farmer had a heart and decided they wanted to keep the siblings together, or if they needed two children of a similar age, that type of thing. They had work available to do for two children of that age. And their placements were not dependent upon family. They were just on the amount of work that could be expected of a child of that age and the needs of the farmer. So there was really no thought to keep brothers and sisters together. It did happen, by chance, but that really wasn't the intention. And we've been promoting the story of the home children for a long time, and there has been a lot of people historically that have been out there, David Lorente, and Ivy Susie and Judy Neville and all kinds of people that have been busy promoting the story of the home children. But we still have a long ways to go to make sure that people in Canada still know about their stories. I mean, you still talk to people and you ask them if they've heard about the home children, and it's just that blank look on their face. They have no idea what we're talking about. But having said that, there's more and more people that I do talk to that do know, or they have heard about it, or they have read an article, or they did read a book. So we are making our way in Canada and sharing the story, which is to the credit of a lot of people. Many home children went on to make good lives in Canada and to make good and great contributions. And, I think that, as we work through these stories, that we always have to remember that. And we always have to honor the contributions that they did make to our country. I mean, we talk about the service in the wars, and there was over 100,000, there was over 10,000 children who enlisted in the First World War alone. And it's estimated that there's almost 100% enlistment rate of the children that were, eligible to enlist in the war in Canada did, the home children. In the picture that we have here on the slide that I have up, that is Cyril Hewitt and George Beardshaw. They came over in 1938 in the first shipment of children, and up until recently, they were the last two surviving Bernardo boys in Canada. Cyril Hewitt just died recently, unfortunately, and we have George left, and he's also a veteran of the Second World War, the Queen's Own Rifles. So we keep in contact with him very closely up in London, where he lives. And this is just a slide that's just showing the service of the home children in our wars. We had two Victoria Cross winners, Claude Nooney and Walter Rayfield. There's lots of sources out there where you can go and that you can find information about the home children. On our website, which is homechildrencanada.ca, we have a section there about how to research your home child. So there's a lot of good sources and a lot of good websites that are linked. So if you visit that page, you'll be able to, go through some of the more pertinent sites in researching your home children. One of the most current things that we've had come up was the release of the 1921 Census of England and Wales. And this is an exclusive release from Find My Pass. It's an important release for the research of the home children. And I've just got a little slide up here that shows you the type of information that you're going to get on the census. They give full names now, and they're not giving just initials. And of course, they're going to give what your relationship is to the head of the household. The first clip that I have up there is from Barkingside in 1921. So they're all going to be listed as an inmate. It gives their age, and it gives whether both of their parents are alive or dead, which I've never seen on a census before, which is really important information for us with our home children. It also will tell you where they were born, if it's known, and the whole or full-time note that they have over there. Sometimes it says full-time, sometimes it says part-time. That is their attendance in school. So, whether they went to school or they didn't, or if they went part-time or they went full-time. And then if they had a job, that would be listed there as too. So Emily does have a job as a messenger. Quite likely she wasn't immigrated to Canada as a home child, given her age was 17. And one of the other interesting things that you can find at the bottom of the census release is this little box that you have at the bottom here. And that tells you how many males, how many females, how many persons are living in the home, and how many rooms. So in this example, we have 4 people living in a 5-room home. So that little box there will give you some idea of the living conditions that that the child was living at during that time, and give you some idea of maybe an overcrowded situation, that type of thing. So that's is a lot of valuable information. The census has been released exclusively by Find My Past, so you can visit their website and you'll be able to search that census. Now, there's a lot of books that have been released, that on the home children. And again, if we do have a Facebook page on Facebook that lists a lot of the books. I think we're pretty current with all the books that are available out there that have been written about the home children. It's our British Home Child Book Club, and you just need to do a search on your Facebook for that, and that will come up. One of the most interesting books that we've had released has been The Forgotten Home Child by Genevieve Graham. This book was released in the beginning of 2020, just as the COVID outbreak broke out. It was the bestseller for 4 months that year. And it's still a book that keeps on giving. And I highly recommend that book. I was the historical consultant on this book, so I'm going to tell you that the facts in this book are historically correct, and they're right bang on. It really gives not only a true to life story of the home children, but it also gives you a very good historical overview of the child migration programs. So she did a really, really good job on that one. We have another series of books that was also published that it's the same thing. I did work with the author, but she worked a lot with our group on Facebook. But it's called No Journey Too Far, that Carrie Tunsky wrote. And then she followed it up. Well, actually, it's No Ocean Too Wide, followed up by No Journey Too Far. And again, in these books, it's a very compelling, true to life story of a family that was affected by the home children. And her historical facts in those books are bang on as well, too. So, again, it's the same as The Forgotten Home Child. You're going to get a really good historical lesson in those books. I'm just going to show you a few other little things that I have here. Before we kind of tie up here. When we go back to, the families and where the families, who the families were, more and more, through the power of the internet and stuff, we're getting more of an oversight of these families prior to the children becoming home children. And these are some of the pictures that I have. And this is William John Finch, and he was a homeboy. And when you take a look at that, you can see that that's his mother. So, I mean, she doesn't look like someone who was living in abject poverty. So you have to wonder what happened in that family to cause the breakup of the family, and to cause William to have needed to go into care. This is an original picture of him that was donated by his family. I'm going to show you these other little things because we're always on the lookout for these. Every child in their trunk carried Bibles. And this was, I'm not going to open it because it's not in very good shape, but it was a Dr. Bernardo Bible. And then they had a prayer book. So this is one of an example of the many styles of prayer books. And that it does belong to Mr. Finch. And on the inside, you can see where his name was written and his immigration date. Bernardo's generally has a big sticker inside theirs with Dr. Bernardo's picture inside there. So, so that's pretty easy to recognize. And I'm just going to show you one more artifact. there's a lot of fundraising that went on in England during the years, and this is a penny box that was set out in the communities for Dr. Bernardo's, and people would be encouraged to put their spare change in there, the pennies in there. And I don't know, but once a month or something like that, a representative from Bernardo's would come around to your establishment and they would pick up the penny box. Okay. And as you were told in the beginning of the segment, Home Children Canada is very pleased to announce that as of 2 weeks ago, we've now become a registered charity in Canada. And we're super excited about that. I think it gives us an official voice, but also will secure the future for the work for home children and secure our work that we've done. And we're hoping to be able to establish a museum and archive in the next year. And I'm looking at the city of Orillia to have that put in. We hold lots and lots of artifacts, and it would be lovely to have something put in place so that the general public could come up and they could share in the artifacts and view them and and get information and stuff like that. So we have a lot of plans coming down the pipelines. I in fact have a meeting tonight with our board of directors and discussing our movement forward. So it's awesome. I'm over the moon that that we qualified and that we have this bright future ahead of us for Home Children Canada. You can get in contact with us. You can visit our website, which is homechildrencanada.ca. You can join our Facebook group, British Home Children Advocacy and Research Association, which is what it says. It's a research association, and we also advocate for the home children. We have over 10,000 members, and we have a lot of really good seasoned researchers, which is really awesome to see see the work that they do. And you just drop your home child's name in there or the information that you're looking for, and these super sleuths, as we call them, they just start to work, and it's all done at no charge to our families. And we've been able to put together hundreds and hundreds of stories through this group. So I'm very, very proud of the work done there. We have a separate Facebook page for Home Children Canada. So on the Home Children Canada page, you can keep up to date on the work being done by Home Children Canada. We don't do research, if they send us a message or something, I'm never going to turn anybody down for research. We will, but it's not really the place where we do our research and stuff like that. That's more for the administration of Home Children Canada. So you can keep up to date on what we're doing. You can also email us at info@britishhomechildren.com. And we'd be happy to answer your email. Sometimes it takes us a little while to get back. Sometimes we have a lot of requests and stuff coming in, and sometimes we just have life that gets in the way as well too. But we also, we do make a good effort to get back to any message that's sent to us. So thank you for having me here today. And I think that concludes the presentation for today.
Well, thanks so much, Lori. That's a lot of resources, lots of tips. A lot to process, but a lot of leads. So that's great, very illuminating. There are some questions in YouTube. Some of them came in as you were presenting. So there's a question. Who paid for the services of the children contractually? So I think that might have been asked. You might have explained a bit more afterwards, but if there's anything else you wanted to add or clarify.
No, the farmers had to pay. The farmers had to pay the contracts. Whoever took or the household, whoever took the child in, because not all girls were placed on farms. Many were placed in households as domestics and stuff like that. But the money had to go into the sending organizations. And again, the sending organizations held that money in trust. It was paid for by the farmers. And, there's all kinds of different scenarios that went on with this. There were some children that, didn't seem to get seemed to think that the farmers had to pay them. So there was a lot of court action done with some of the children. So, but no, typically they paid the sending organizations the money.
And a follow-up, another payment question. Maybe there's confusion because this person's ancestor, and thank you everyone who's asking questions, appreciate that.
Sure.
Who paid for the Bernard Boys to go back to England to serve in the British Navy? So maybe a bit of question there about the ancestor serving in the British Navy rather than in the Canadian forces. But I
The
guess there's a
children
lot
would
of
have paid their own passages back. I mean, we've had many home children that did go back to the UK to serve in the British Army as well too during the war. And I don't know the details about enlistments and stuff like that. So I would think that the home child would have paid their own passage back. I can't think that the sending organizations would have done that. No.
And another question is, are there written testimonies of girls that were shipped to Canada? If so, where can I find these?
There's all kinds of written testimonies. I mean, I've published a book called Bleeding of the Lambs, and there's many stories in there of the girls. I mean, I've got the girls in my family, and we just had another book that was recently published on the Middlemore families and stuff too. I think the best thing to do is to go to our Facebook page for our book club and to take a look through there. Phyllis Harrison wrote a wonderful book that has a lot of testimonies of female home children in her book as well too. So there's a lot out there. Also, we do publish a newsletter about 4 times a year. And there's many stories in our newsletter archive, which is accessible on British homechildrencanada.ca. I'm sorry, we just changed the URL. But those newsletters are also available publicly, and those stories are in there too as well. So lots of resources for that.
Well, that's great. This person's just sharing. When their father-in-law returned home from serving in the British Navy in World War I, the farm that he had been sent to, the whole family had died of the Spanish flu. So yeah, certainly that was happening at the end of the First World War.
Mm-hmm. A lot of home children didn't return to families. You know, they had nobody, a lot of them. But it's like I said, there was over 100,000 children that came. So there's a whole variety of stories. So not everyone is going to fit into the typical story. But typically, when they came back, there was no family here for them, unless they had a good relationship with the farming family. Because I'm sure if Cecil Bennett had survived the war, he would have come back to that family and back to that farm. And, we've had a lot of home children. I just did some research for one yesterday, and she lived her entire life with the family that took her in. And, she's even buried with them. She never married, but she stayed with them for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you find that any of the children who served overseas, did any of them stay in England afterwards? Was going back? Would you say, maybe you haven't assessed the percentage, but would that have been fairly frequent?
I wouldn't say that it was fairly common, but I would say that yes, it did happen. And, so I think that, we have a long ways to go in our research of the service. And one of the things that Home Children Canada is proposing to do, now that we have means to do funding, and we can also enlist the help of the student community service hours here in Canada now for our high school students and stuff, is we're proposing to build a huge database of all the home children who served. Now, we do have a listing of about 500 for the Second World War, and we have about 1,100 who died in the First World War. But there is, with our British Home Child Registry that we have up, we are aiming to put all the enlistments in the registry. But I'm aiming to, in the meantime, because our base is still being worked on for that, is I'm approaching a school that I've done a lot of historical work on the wars with the service. About working with us and creating a large index of all the children who served in the war. And once we have these indexes in place, then we're going to be able to better pull up stats, And I think stats are something that is really desperately needed with the work that we do with the home children. And, and I'm very conscious of that. And that's something that, moving forward, that I really want to work on to have that available so that we can better, better enable our studies, have better information, and to be able to answer that question. Because I do know that home children stayed in the UK after they served in the war, but I couldn't even begin to pull a number out to say how many did. So hopefully, in the years to come, we're gonna improve that. So we estimate that over 25,000 home children served in the collective wars. So we aim to have over 25,000 in this new index that I'm proposing.
Oh, thanks for that. Just curious if there's a standard size that the trunks often were, or an approximate size. Maybe not. Or if there's anything.
Yeah, what, I do have the sizes. I can't remember it off the top of my head,
Yeah.
but I do have the sizes listed on our Home Children in Canada website. We have a whole page there about the trunks. And as I'm going through and listing the trunks, I'm also putting the sizes up. Do we have a few minutes just to kind of muck around here a bit?
Sure. Yeah, and I guess if it kind of stands out as a child's trunk, that might be a clue too.
Share here for just a moment, if I can. Okay, I'm just throwing up another screen share. Can we see this screen at all? Okay, so we kind of go through, there's a whole bunch of various trunks that the children used over the years. So there is really no one set standard size of trunk, really.
Right.
Now the Cecil Bennett trunk that we have, its typical size is 12 inches high, 14 inches deep, and 27.5 inches wide. And and that's your tin covered, alligator skin type trunk. And so that's a typical size for that. And this is the most common type of Bernardo trunk that was sent here to Canada, but certainly not the only one. This is another trunk, and this is a Hazelbray trunk that was brought in about 1913, in about those years. So the size of that would be a little bit different. As we go through, we see trunks being packed up in the UK, and girls would have these bags on the ships and in the trains and stuff as they were going across, because of course their trunks would have been in the belly of the ship, so they wouldn't be able to access them on their journey. And this is another type of trunk from Maria Rye. And as you kind of go through it, this is another Bernardo trunk that was sent over. That was, it was the full wooden trunk that they made. And this one is 26 inches by 16 inches by 15 inches high. That's a Quarrier trunk. And another one of the Bernardo trunks. So there's all kinds of sizes and variation of the trunks. Some children, as you see in this picture here, brought their belongings in sacks on the ship. And Canada, I'm just looking, that's another wooden one. And this trunk, I would have, if it didn't have his name on this trunk, I would have said that wasn't a home child trunk. And this one is very different. It was one of the very, very earlier trunks, dated in around, when did I say he came? Oh, 1880. That's what I got it right there, Walter Patterson. And this is an Annie Mcpherson trunk. This trunk measures 42 inches wide by 22 inches high and 21 inches deep. And it is as heavy as anything. I cannot lift up this trunk and move it. In fact, I have that trunk right beside me at the bottom here. Okay, and then on top of it, I have a Waifs and Strays trunk. I don't know if you can run the comparison between, a smaller trunk and this big, large trunk that was brought by Walter Patterson. And typically they were never that big. And I kind of think that maybe once they brought a few of those over to Canada, they kind of thought they weren't doing that anymore.
Right, yeah, there goes my guess, but a child's trunk would be a sign.
Yeah, like, I mean, it's a
Yeah.
ridiculous size for a child's trunk, but it all like that name on the front of the trunk. I mean, how they have that name printed on the trunk is pretty typical of a British home child trunk. And as well, there's newspapers and stuff inside this trunk that dated to the date when he did come to Canada. So that is a home child trunk, but it is enormous. And I don't know how they ever managed that. There's no wheels on the bottom. It's crazy. So we're still doing a lot of learning about the trunks that came over, you know, and unfortunately, I don't think that there's too many of the trunks that actually survive. So it's great that we're all having a peek at it now because, you know, we want to keep our eyes out for these types of things. And a lot of the trunks are made by the children themselves in the, you know, in the in the organizations such as Couriers and Bernardo's and stuff like that. So they weren't very fancy. There wouldn't be a lot of embellishments on the trunks, that kind of thing. And sometimes, you know, they would have stickers on it. Like you see this trunk that I have up on screen now, it's got the William Couriers, and then it's got the sticker that says not wanted. Well, I mean, they didn't mean the child wasn't wanted, but it's kind of sad to see that on one of their trunks anyways. But yeah, and this is another different variety altogether of Courier trunk. So there's all kinds of different varieties, shapes, and sizes. So it's hard to say a typical size, but typical is pretty small and pretty plain, you know, they're not very fancy at all. Okay, so I hope that helps with that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks so much for that. I think that's all of our questions answered. So just another big thank you. Really appreciate you doing this talk, and for everyone who attended. Thanks so much.
Thanks everyone for coming out and for having me. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.